Look, women don't. They basically just don't think like that.
Millions of years of evolution, right? Men have to stick it in every place they can, but for women it is just about security and commitment and whatever the fuck else.
A little oversimplified, Alice, but yes, something like that.
If you men only knew.
On March 1st, 1999, Stanley Kubrick, perhaps the most influential and celebrated movie director of the 20th century for his nearly impeccable filmography featuring such classics as Spartacus, 2001: A Space Odyssey, Dr. Strangelove, A Clockwork Orange, The Shining, and Full Metal Jacket, hosted a screening of the final cut of his most recent effort for his family and the film's stars. Eyes Wide Shut, an erotic psychological drama about a doctor played by Tom Cruise who is shocked and disturbed when his spouse, played by Cruise's then real-life wife, Nicole Kidman, reveals that she contemplated having an affair, setting him off on an evening adventure highlighted by the infiltration of a secret society's masked orgy, was classic Kubrick. The heightened dramatic stakes, the peculiar motivations of the protagonist, the dark and disturbing themes, and of course the immaculately mounted cinematography that perfectly encapsulates the uneasy and mysterious mood of the film were all vintage elements of the acclaimed director as he entered his fifth decade of filmmaking. Like many of his productions, it hadn't been easy. Originally scheduled to be a 15-month shoot, the film took nearly 2.5 years to finish. Fans and critics alike wondered whether the famously fussy and obsessive auteur would ever finish and feared his enormous effort would just fizzle out. There was speculation that the studio would spike the project, which lacked the more broad-based appeal of the more fan-friendly fare in the theaters like George Lucas's long-awaited Star Wars prequel, Pixar's highly anticipated sequel to its breakout hit Toy Story, and even comedy vehicles like Austin Powers from rising SNL alum turned movie star Mike Myers. And there were further concerns that Kubrick himself would scuttle the release, as Warner Brothers had reportedly given him a contractual concession that the movie could only be released if they allowed him final cut. And so, far from a typical screening, Kubrick settled in for the viewing with a mixture of emotions, ranging from excitement and relief over finishing what had been an extraordinarily laborious film, even by his standards, to nervousness and dread over its reception and just how he and it would fit into the modern cinematic landscape. Still, ensconced in his massive 18th century compound around 30 miles north of London, and well known for preferring his privacy to the limelight, Stanley Kubrick went to great lengths to insulate himself from the fickle demands of Hollywood, impacting his artistic pursuits. Although some interpreted this as reclusiveness or a sourness towards humanity, Kubrick's friends insisted this was far from the truth. Michael Herr, Kubrick's co-screenwriter on his Vietnam classic Full Metal Jacket, said, quote, "Stanley was, in fact, a complete failure as a recluse, unless you believe that a recluse is simply someone who seldom leaves his house. Stanley saw a lot of people and was one of the most gregarious men I ever knew, and it didn't change anything that most of this conviviality went on over the phone." Indeed, most photographs of Kubrick seemed to paint a glowering and aloof figure, but the reality was he was tender, shy, and fiercely passionate about his work and the technology behind it, prompting his wife to once comment that, quote, "Stanley would be happy with 8 tape recorders and 1 pair of pants." And it's hard to argue with the results. During his lifetime, he amassed a reputation as a perfectionist whose painstaking care over every element of the final work, from writing, editing, and even color correcting, to promotion and exhibition, resulted in some of the most breathtakingly innovative and important films in history. He won his Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, remarkably his only Oscar, for 2001: A Space Odyssey, which Steven Spielberg has referred to as one of the greatest movies ever made, and the big bang of his generation for propelling the art form into modernity. And despite his advancing age, Kubrick showed little signs of slowing down. Eyes Wide Shut is just as daring and boundary-pushing as A Clockwork Orange in many ways, and he was never content to take paycheck movies just to satisfy the masses, preferring to channel his energies into more meaningful art. But he wasn't a joyless scold either. Indeed, on Saturday, March 6th, just a few days after the screening, Kubrick was a bundle of energy, watching England's rugby match against Ireland and chatting away on the phone with an old friend, Julian Sr., who was the Senior VP of European Advertising and Publicity for Warner Brothers. They were supposed to finalize the poster design for the upcoming promotion and release of Eyes Wide Shut, but Stanley kept interrupting to provide a running commentary on the rugby match. There was no hint of any illness, nor any indication that the great director was going to settle down and call it a career. And just hours later, at 4 a.m. on Sunday, March 7th, 1999, Stanley Kubrick died in his sleep from a heart attack. Senior would later say, quote, "Stanley finished with his life less than a week after he finished with his movie. If you'd stood back and written it, people would have laughed." Stanley Kubrick was 70 years old. I'm Derek Kaufman.
I'm Jason Beckerman.
And this is Last Days, Stanley Kubrick.
Already a living legend for the last few decades of his life, the death of Stanley Kubrick rocked the film community. He was such a titanic force in the industry, at once experimental enough to be mentioned alongside avant-garde directors like Jean-Luc Godard, Luis Buñuel, and Kenneth Anger, but with enough commercial mainstream appeal to bear mention in the pantheon of Alfred Hitchcock, Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Steven Spielberg. There's truly nobody quite like him in the history of cinema. Perhaps someone like Quentin Tarantino comes close, finicky and obsessive about his projects, incredibly detail-oriented with a voluminous sense of film history, and someone whose every film becomes an enormously anticipated event. But Quentin is much quirkier and open with the public. Kubrick will forever be veiled in a bit more mystery, giving his preference for privacy and letting the work speak for itself. In a 1960 interview, Kubrick explained this philosophy, saying, quote, "One of the things I always find extremely difficult when a picture's finished is when a writer or a film reviewer asks, 'Now what is it that you were trying to say in this picture?' And without being thought too presumptuous for using this analogy, I like to remember what T.S. Eliot said to someone who asked him what he meant by the poem The Wasteland. To which he replied, 'I meant what I said. If I could have said it any differently, I would have.'" Consistent with his wishes, Kubrick's funeral was held 5 days after his death with only close friends and family in attendance. Media was kept a mile away outside the entrance gate to the massive property. Among the attendees who gave eulogies were Steven Spielberg, Nicole Kidman, and Tom Cruise. Kubrick was buried next to his favorite tree on the estate. The reception of his final film, Eyes Wide Shut, was a bit mixed at the time, although it has aged well and accepted by film enthusiasts as one of his finest works. Upon its release, Stephen Hunter of the Washington Post said the film was actually, quote, "sad rather than bad," and remarked the film felt creaky, ancient, hopelessly out of touch, infatuated with the hot taboos of his youth, and unable to connect with that twisty thing contemporary sexuality has become. Kubrick himself reportedly told Warner Brothers executives that he believed the film was to be his best ever upon the final screening just days before his death.
Kubrick also left behind several unfinished projects, and some of his unrealized projects have become the stuff of Hollywood legend. Perhaps most famously, Kubrick desperately wanted to make a film about the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, as he was fascinated by the French leader's military accomplishments and penchant for self-destruction. He found the existing treatments, including Abel Gantz's 1927 film classic, to be terrible representations of the subject, and wanted to make a movie that directly dealt with the man's capacity for evil and wrestled with the psychological intensity, sexual predilections, and military genius of Napoleon. He drafted a screenplay in 1961 and planned a grand-scale epic with Jack Nicholson in the lead role and tens of thousands of extras for battle sequences. The film even went into pre-production and was scheduled to start filming in 1969 when MGM suddenly scrapped it for budgetary reasons and the poor reception of a 1970 Soviet film about Napoleon's last stand called Waterloo. As recently as a decade ago, Steven Spielberg flirted with the idea of adapting Kubrick's screenplay into a miniseries, but it never materialized. Ridley Scott made a recent movie starring Joaquin Phoenix in the titular role, which received somewhat mixed reviews and left many to wonder if Kubrick would have been able to pull it off.
You know, I just saw that movie, actually, and
it's impossible not to think about Stanley Kubrick when you watch it.
It's okay. It's very Kubrick-esque.
It's got all the sexual stuff in
it has
the
all
movie.
the sexual stuff. It's dark and gloomy, and then with fierce battle scenes. But it's not nearly as good as what he could have done. Ridley Scott's a
genius in his own right. Yeah.
A Hall of Famer, a Mount Rushmore guy in his own right, but he's no Kubrick.
Ridley's the right guy if you don't have Kubrick, because he has that icy sort of mood that he brings to Alien and stuff like that, but he's also got a commercial appeal that Stanley Kubrick didn't care about.
There were a lot
much.
of big explosions in the movie that I think Kubrick would have just left on the cutting room floor. He wouldn't have had any time for that at all. It's interesting. He was such a mercurial dude. I'm sure you're going to talk about this more, but you can see him sort of desperately wanting to do somebody like Bonaparte. And God, can you imagine the poor actor who had to sit for it, though? I mean, he was famously difficult.
Peak Jack Nicholson in the 60s. It would have been something to behold.
Something else. Fans still wonder about Napoleon, but they were able to see Kubrick's other pet project come to life on the screen in the form of a Steven Spielberg movie. In the early 1990s, Kubrick expanded a short story called Super Toys Last All Summer Long about a futuristic robot that resembles and behaves like a real child. He approached Spielberg in 1995 with the idea of producing a movie with Spielberg directing. Following Kubrick's death, Spielberg took the drafts and notes and directed AI, artificial intelligence, which was a modest success for Spielberg, but left many fans wondering if the icy remove of Kubrick's bleaker view of humanity might have better served the material.
Jason, can you imagine that the two movies that are most associated with unfinished Kubrick projects were Napoleon, which was just recently made by Ridley Scott, and AI, which is maybe the hottest topic on everyone's mind right now? He died 26 years ago, and he still feels vibrant. He feels prescient. He feels current. That's, we talk about people who are ahead of their time. Kubrick was that during his entire lifetime.
You go back to something like Strangelove, which to me is his greatest movie and one of my favorite movies of all time. And the reason is because the themes that he addresses in this sort of, post-World War II, apocalyptic showdown, Soviet-American showdown kind of movie, it's those themes are so alive today, and Kubrick just pitch perfect on all of them. The American bravado, the intellects versus the warmongers, that
I'm
whole
so
thing.
glad you brought up Dr. Strangelove. This week, when we are recording this, the biggest story in the news is Elon Musk's Hitler salute during the inauguration. There's a whole bit in that movie that's now going around as a meme where the guy can't not make a Nazi salute, and he's holding his arm down. It's Peter Sellers' famous bit from that movie. And it's current and it's relevant right now. It's just incredible that Kubrick comes up in all aspects.
Do you think
of
Musk
life.
might have been channeling that purposefully?
I think it was
occurred to me.
fully intentional, and I think he was.
I know it was intentional.
Yeah.
I know he was trolling also, but I wonder if he had.
He was thinking that moment.
I don't know. There were a handful of other projects Kubrick tried to get off the ground, including a project about the Nazis titled Aryan Papers, and even a porno movie based on a satirical novel by Terry Southern. The Beatles even approached Kubrick to direct them in a film adaptation of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Glad that didn't happen.
That one I'm glad was left on the cutting room floor.
Ever the iconoclast and always leery about tackling big budget IP with a meddlesome studio worried more about the bottom line than art, Kubrick refused, clearing the path to Peter Jackson's classic trilogy a few years later.
Getting your arms around the legacy of a filmmaker as significant and influential as Stanley Kubrick is a bit of an impossible task. The depth of his genius and mastery of cinema could easily be explored through any of his films, but it's probably most illustrative to examine his career through the lens of what I consider to be his 5 most impactful films, and those most emblematic of his prodigious talent: Spartacus, Dr. Strangelove, 2001: A Space Odyssey, A Clockwork Orange, and The Shining. A few caveats at the outset. This is an inherently subjective exercise. There are diehard fans for everything in the Kubrick canon. Countless books and essays have been written about everything from Paths of Glory to Barry Lyndon to Full Metal Jacket. All of Kubrick's efforts, even his less successful ones, would probably be in the pantheon of any other director. But it's still instructive to take a deeper look at the ones most often cited as his most important works. Again, it's a bit like Tarantino. Hateful Eight is a masterful work in its own right, but any analysis of Tarantino's career will probably gloss over it in favor of Pulp Fiction and Inglourious Bastards. So let's start with Spartacus. That's his 1960 movie.
That you identify the body or the living person of the slave called Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus.
I'm Spartacus!
I'm Spartacus. I'm Spartacus.
Just a few years into his career, Kubrick got a call from Kirk Douglas asking him to direct Spartacus after he fired the first director tapped for the film. It was a huge Hollywood production with an A-list movie star, a decorated screenwriter in Dalton Trumbo, a cast of over 10,000 people and extras, and a massive, for that time, $6 million budget. To that point, Kubrick's biggest credit was a World War I movie called Paths of Glory, but this would be an epic on a far vaster scale. He was in his early 30s and already taking on something enormous, and the expectations were sky high. As with many big projects with lots of studio input and big egos on set, there were conflicts, especially between Douglas and Kubrick, battling for creative control. But the movie ended up being a commercial and critical hit, bringing in $60 million at the box office and receiving 6 Academy Award nominations, of which it won 4. It was also the last time Kubrick and Douglas would work together, but the result of their one collaboration solidified the director's place in the film industry and opened up a host of new opportunities.
It's interesting. Douglas at the time was one of the biggest stars in the world.
Massive.
Kubrick's a young director that most people hadn't heard of, and he was famously difficult to work with. You know, take after take, the opposite of like a Clint Eastwood, who's like a one take guy. He would do hundreds of takes for the smallest scene. His direction was apparently the most picayune points of an actor's facial gestures. And I can imagine, and they never worked together again, and it was famously fraught on set because Douglas was not going to take it from this young punk, and they were just at each other's throats constantly.
And the movie comes out brilliant. I mean, it stands the test of time. You're right. He was so uncompromising. He was the young, upstart sort of director. And Kirk Douglas, by that time, was already, as you said, a massive star. A little bit shades of Blake Lively being the big star on the set with Justin Baldoni, who fashions himself a young Kubrick.
Kirk Douglas. I mean, forget about what Baldoni might think of himself. To compare Kirk Douglas,
I really wish I hadn't done it.
Reject that. You need to retract that right now.
As it came out of my mouth, I was like, "Am I really going to do this?"
Yeah,
I'm gonna take it
You're
back.
gonna pull that back.
Take us through Dr. Strangelove, which is maybe one of my top 3 comedies of all time.
Just 4 years after Spartacus, Kubrick decided to tackle an entirely different genre with Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, a satirical black comedy about nuclear anxieties during the Cold War.
What did you say?
I said Premier Kissoff is a degenerate atheistic
Mr. President, I formally request that the signal...
I'm sorry,
Mr. President, I think they're trying the number.
You filthy bully, you filthy... You sell you guy! Not tasting about him before, hey? You war-mongering bully!
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Originally pitched as a serious political thriller, Kubrick changed it into a black comedy, perhaps influenced by his work with Peter Sellers just a couple years earlier on Lolita. He tapped noted journalist and satirist Terry Southern to transform the script, pulling together a $2 million budget, and ended up making one of the sharpest and most trenchant comedies on the subject ever made. Even today, the film has a near-perfect 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. It was named the 3rd greatest comedy of all time by the American Film Institute. Peter Sellers playing multiple roles in a single movie changed the landscape of comedies, paving the way for Eddie Murphy in the Nutty Professor movies and Mike Myers in the Austin Powers franchise. Some thought the movie trivialized a serious topic, but Kubrick definitely handled the criticism and defended the approach, saying, quote, "A satirist is someone who has a very skeptical view of human nature, but who still has the optimism to make some sort of a joke out of it, however brutal that joke might be."
This movie is pure genius. I often think, when I think of Dr. Strangelove and that Kubrick directed one of the greatest comedies of all time, he's not thought of as a comedic director. It's how I think of this story about Picasso where, you know, he paints abstractly and everyone looks at it and says that a child could do that. And he once famously said, you know, I could paint the Mona Lisa. I can paint realistic things. I choose to do these other things that are more meaningful to me. This was Kubrick showing like, oh, you think comedies are funny? There's a lot of slapstick comedies in that era. He made one of the sharpest black comedies of all time that could be released today and stand up.
It's maybe, in my opinion, the greatest movie ever made. Honestly, it's that good. It's not my favorite movie I've ever seen. It's not the most watchable movie, but it may be the greatest movie ever made. The combination of satire and obviously his cinematography is through the roof, and the greatest ending scene of a movie ever.
Incredible.
And
riding the nuclear bomb down. I mean, how do you top that?
It's just an incredible movie. Anyway.
But we'll move on to what is considered his masterpiece. It's 2001, A Space Odyssey in 1968.
Do you read me, Hal?
Affirmative, Dave. I read you.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
With a groundbreaking historical epic and black comedy under his belt, Kubrick set his eyes on the next frontier, science fiction. Spent several years developing 2001, A Space Odyssey after reading Arthur C. Clarke's work, and the two collaborated on a screenplay about the evolutionary transition from ape to human to alien superintelligence. If Dr. Strangelove is one of the most important comedies of all time, 2001 is flat out one of the most important movies of all time. Kubrick intensively researched for the film, even getting permission from NASA to observe some of their spacecrafts, and ended up delivering a dazzling spectacle of imagination grounded by real science. Although not an immediate hit with critics due to limited dialogue and slow pacing, the film ended up gaining popularity and is today widely considered to be one of the greatest and most influential movies of all time, earning Kubrick his only personal Academy Award for visual effects. There's not much you can say about 2001 that hasn't been said. It's one of the most important films ever committed to cinema. It is groundbreaking. It's a tough watch as well because it is now an old movie, but HAL and what it says about AI even today. It's just
iconic.
prescient.
We think about it as sort of a shorthand for the takeover of computers over our lives and the moment that computers become sentient and start running our world and ignoring our commands, which
here we are.
Could happen any minute.
Closer
right?
than ever, right?
Exactly.
And it's a remarkable movie. If you haven't seen 2001, you have to see that movie.
And then after the enormity of the undertaking for 2001, Kubrick decided to downshift to a smaller project and ended up releasing what may have been his most iconic film.
Right, Pete, check the rest of the house. 10. I'm singing in the road, just singing in the road. What a glorious feeling. I'm happy again. I'm laughing at clouds.
A Clockwork Orange is based on the Anthony Burgess novel and explores the degeneration of youth culture, which was a huge preoccupation during the social upheaval of the late 60s and early 70s. Because of the truly upsetting depictions of teenage violence and sexuality, it remains one of his most controversial films, and remains a lightning rod in many conversations about the depiction and glorification of violence in cinema. It received an X rating, which is pretty much box office poison, but the rating also created enormous intrigue among the viewing public, and even the censor of the film, John Trevelyan, said the movie was, quote, perhaps the most brilliant piece of cinematic art I've ever seen, and defended the movie as more of an intellectual argument rather than a sadistic spectacle. It received 4 Oscar nominations but didn't win, although Best Director winner William Friedkin, who took home his award for The French Connection, heaped praise on Kubrick's masterpiece, saying, quote, I think Stanley Kubrick is the best American filmmaker of the year. In fact, not just this year, but the best. Period.
You rarely hear the winner of Best Director heap that much praise, but he was one of those figures who everyone respected and exalted and was really deserving of it.
A very hard watch, that movie.
Tough.
But good God, is it good.
It's so
well
good.
done.
It is so good. And I think his last most important contribution to cinema, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention The Shining in 1980.
Here's Johnny.
Already widely considered a master by this point, Kubrick's next big project brought him to a genre often reserved for upcoming filmmakers looking to cut their teeth on low-budget fare to gain a foothold in the film industry, and that's, of course, horror. The Shining was adapted from a pulpy Stephen King book, but Kubrick ended up taking the source material and transforming it into one of the best horror films of all time. The steady descent of Jack Nicholson's character into madness during a stay as a winter caretaker in an isolated hotel with his family is positively terrifying, and left viewers with some of the most indelible images ever put on film. The unsettling twin girls, the blood-filled elevator, the typewriter filled with the same line over and over again, the hedge maze, and of course, Nicholson's head jammed through an axe-splintered doorway shouting, "Here's Johnny." Kubrick revolutionized the use of Steadicam in this movie, which had first been put to great use in Rocky a few years earlier, but reached its full potential in the scenes of Jack stalking his young son in the hedge maze at the conclusion of the film. At the time, the reception was mixed, and Stephen King actually detested the film and disliked Kubrick personally, but it's now widely considered to be a horror classic. It's difficult to comprehend and fully convey the greatness of Stanley Kubrick without coming off like a pretentious film snob. His magnificent skills as a filmmaker forever changed the landscape of cinema, and his influence on the medium is still felt today amongst the masters of the art form. You can see it in the disorienting zoom shots in a Martin Scorsese movie, the moody darkness of a David Fincher movie, the expression of inner turmoil in a P.T. Anderson movie, and even in the beautifully rendered sequences and emotional resonance of a Steven Spielberg movie. And although their sensibilities couldn't contrast more sharply, Spielberg's best films capture the sense of awe and wonder of his characters as they confront everything from the horrors of World War II to a cute alien waddling up to a suburban home, while Kubrick was most comfortable with the icy coldness of people and the depths of depravity and isolation that are central to the human experience. But the two actually struck up a deep and lasting friendship during the 80s. Kubrick, the old master auteur, helping to transform Spielberg from the best director of summer blockbusters into a more fully realized artist. And it's no surprise that Spielberg even shepherded one of Kubrick's unfinished projects, AI Artificial Intelligence, over the finish line, using the drafts and notes left by Kubrick to release the film in 2001. Although he recognized the difficulty of finishing the project of the greatest master he had ever served, and admitted that, quote, he felt like he was being coached by a ghost. And so I wanted to give the final word to Steven Spielberg himself, fittingly being reduced to a state of boyish awe and wonder as he reflected on the inimitable magnificence of Kubrick's body of work.
When you look at all of his films, even though they all have one thing in common, for me anyway, the craft is impeccable. Every film he's ever made, the craft is impeccable. The lighting, the dolly shots, the crane moves, the zoom-ins on Barry Lyndon, the framing, the lighting, the hot windows as backlight, there's the compositions. I mean, the exact compositions. You had to hit your mark precisely to please Stanley so he'd get his painting, the painting he was putting on canvas for you to appreciate. It had to be perfect. His choice of lenses, his Steadicam work in latter year films, impeccable, the best in history. Nobody could shoot a movie better than Stanley Kubrick in history.